I'm Jace Chambers. I'm the Community Engagement and Marketing Associate with Opera Lafayette, and we are so pleased to have you with our first Salon series of the season, featuring the Madame de Pompadour. I would like to go ahead and introduce Julia Doe, our Artistic Associate this season, who will be one of our hosts for our Salon series, as well as our Artistic Director, Ryan Brown. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Julia now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jace. Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you back for another season of wonderful concerts, for a wonderful season of enrichment educational programming. As you know, this year we are moving back in time from the era of Marie Antoinette to the era of Madame de Pompadour several decades earlier. And we're also moving away from, say, the patronage of a queen and to the patronage of a royal mistress, which adds all sorts of interesting questions about artistic and musical development that our distinguished guest is going to outline for us today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. We're so pleased to welcome today Professor Christine Adams, who's Professor of European History at St. Mary's College of Maryland. She publishes primarily in French gender and family history of the 17th to the 19th centuries. Her most recent book, The Creation of the French Royal Mistress from Agnès Sorel to Madame du Barry, and I hate that my visual aid is covered with a packet from the Columbia Library, but it's a very beautiful book, I promise. This was co-authored with Tracy Adams, and it examines the rise of the royal mistress as a quasi-institutionalized political position in early modern France. Adams was a 2020-21 fellow at the American Council of Learned Societies. That's a huge honor. And a spring 2021 Andrew Mellon long-term fellow at the Newberry Library, where she worked on her new book project, The Merveilleuses and Their Impact on the French Social Imaginary, 1794 to 99 and beyond. And that book focuses on a group of young, stylish, and politically influential Parisian women who came to define the era of the Directory at the end of the 1790s. Professor Adams writes frequently on current events and has particular interest in politics, education, gender, and reproductive rights. We're so glad to hear from her today and to start off this season in style. I'll hand it over to you, Christine.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me here this evening, and thanks to all of you out there who are joining us tonight. I'd like to thank Ryan Brown for inviting me, and for Jace Chambers for helping to arrange all these things for tonight. I do find it so exciting that this season is devoted to the era of Madame de Pompadour. Pompadour was, of course, a celebrated patron of the arts as well as a performer herself. And you actually have a fabulous talk coming up on November 28th, I know, that's going to talk more specifically about Pompadour's musical and her cultural influence. Tonight, I'm going to talk more generally about the tradition of the royal mistress in France, and then specifically how Madame de Pompadour fits into that particular genealogy. As Julia said, the creation and the tradition of the royal mistress is the subject of a book that I wrote with Tracy Adams, who is a professor of comparative literature at the, well, let's see, this is there, okay, at the University of Auckland, who I wanted to acknowledge here since I draw on her analysis as well as my own in this discussion. And as far as we can tell, the position of the French royal mistress and the tradition around it that develops was unique in the early modern European world. So why unique? The position of the powerful French royal mistress is unique in Europe as a recognized extraconjugal social position with its own defining features. And most notably, she had an important position, a political position at the court. Certainly kings in other countries had mistresses, both in medieval and early modern Europe, but only in France did this become a tradition and what we refer to in the book as an open secret. Now, historians often refer to these most prominent mistresses as the official mistress, which is a translation of the term maîtresse en titre. And the term is somewhat anachronistic, actually, until Madame de Pompadour assumes the role. And it's actually even contradictory, given the fact that it is never actually an official position. Of course, people knew who the royal mistress was, but in keeping with the fact that her position was an open secret rather than openly acknowledged, everybody in public would behave as if everything was honorable, in the words of the Queen Catherine de Medici in the 16th century in reference to her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Those of you who are watching The Serpent Queen are probably familiar with both of those. So how does this happen? How did the particular position of the royal mistress emerge, and why does that matter? What we hypothesize based on our reading of the sources and the context is that beginning in the 15th century, there were key structures that converged to create a space at court for the royal mistress. The first of these was an idea of gender that was already in place in France. And that was a tacit belief that while women were legally inferior to men, they were men's equals in competence. So the role of the royal mistress was part of this larger construction of gender. And this conception undergirded feudal law, so dating back to the Middle Ages, actually, which allowed women to wield authority in the absence of a husband or a son or a brother, but only under those circumstances. And this vision of gender is actually fairly common across Europe, but what's unique in France is this vision's particular instantiation in what was called Salic law. Salic law was elaborated over the course of the 15th century, and what it did is it laid out the line of succession to the French throne. It prohibited women from ascending to the throne, and it also prohibited the line from passing through women. It's that very reason, though, the fact that women cannot rule in their own name, that the French tended to prefer the queen consort or the mother as regent when the need arose for that. And the female regent's rule on behalf of, say, her husband or her son was premised on the assumption that women were safer than men because they couldn't take over the throne, they couldn't usurp the throne. And as a mother, she would presumably rule in her child's best interest. So what this means and why it matters. It means that in France, you have no queens like Elizabeth I of England, for example, but you do have powerful regents who rule when their husbands are at war or when their sons are minors. And so, for example, Catherine de Medici, she rules for her son Charles IX. Marie de Medici, she rules for Louis XIII, and Anne of Austria for Louis XIV. And these assumptions about women also form the basis of the role of the official royal mistress. She could take on then the position as the king's advisor and his chief advocate. And she was also the safest of the king's advisors because she was less able to act on her own. She was most dedicated to his interests. If he wins, she wins. So why a mistress as the king's advisor and advocate, you may ask, rather than the queen, who is the king's legitimate partner? And there's a couple of reasons why the king did not rely on the queen to fill that role. Marriages, of course, were arranged for dynastic purposes. So the king had relatively little choice of his wife. Plus, from the 16th century onward, the wives of French kings were usually foreigners. They were very often from enemy states, and that meant that kings couldn't entirely trust their wives. Mistresses were French, and they were dependent on the king for favor, so them they could trust. So that's the first condition. The second condition for the emergence of the French royal mistress is that the period of the European Renaissance is a period during which people start to experience space as theatrical. And we first start to see this in the context of the French court under the King Francois I. He ruled from 1515 to 1547. And it's at the court of Francis that women more generally come to play an important role in the machinations, the political machinations of the court. Now, what we mean by theatricalization is an awareness of oneself and others as performing different roles in different spaces, sort of like we play one role at work, maybe, and another with our families, and another at conferences, and another on social media. So we have these different spaces in which we act in different ways. And the same was true of mistresses at the royal court. Courtly rank and protocol made it possible for these women to have different positions at court. So they could act openly as an attendant to the queen, or maybe as governess to the royal children. In private spaces, they might act as the king's lover, and then as an open secret in other spaces as an advisor to the king in spaces that, say, ambassadors would see them. I think it's important to recognize that the lives of the French king and his courtiers more generally always play out before an audience. They're always performing. Court life is like this dazzling show, and ritual is very important. The most successful courtiers are actors. They're highly self-aware. They're skilled at strategic dissimulation. And to a large extent, we see this theatricalization of court life take place through the eyes of resident ambassadors. They also appear on the European scene around the early 16th century, and they leave us a lot of accounts in their records and their correspondence of the theatrical nature of the French court and the people acting there. So they are actually one of our most important sources for understanding the development of the role of the royal mistress. And then finally, the third condition, this role has to be activated then by an intelligent, charismatic woman who's associated with a king who's willing to accept a woman as advisors. And we see this situation emerge once again with Francis I in the early 16th century, and then especially with Louis XIV and Louis XV. And of course, it's during the reign of Louis XV that Madame de Pompadour will come to play such a key role. So for a long time, historians and others, I think, were reluctant to recognize the political influence of mistresses and of female courtiers more generally. I think they were too influenced by Louis XIV's insistence that he would never allow a woman to influence his policies, which I think he protested too much. But I think we're also influenced by the rather narrow definition of the political that dominated our understanding of politics for too long. And we need to understand that at the early modern court, in the absence of any strict distinction between formal and informal power, that is, people with no official position in the government could still have enormous influence. And because they operated within the framework of family and court networks that valued women as mediators and brokers, this meant that women could indeed exercise significant political power. And in some cases, they actually even had official positions in the Queen's household. So that meant that women were, in fact, very important players in the French court. Now, we, of course, can't ignore the erotic element of the relationship between kings and mistresses, and that's probably what most people are interested in. But, you know, in a society where kings married for dynastic and diplomatic reasons, they're going to seek romance in other relationships. And most of these French royal mistresses are recognized as beautiful women. The early phases of their relationship with their royal lover was undoubtedly based on passion in most cases. However, what's interesting about these relationships is they very often last long beyond the early Romantic period. Madame de Pompadour remained Louis's sort of recognized official mistress, or at least his best friend, and his key political advisor for 20 years, until her death in 1764 at the age of 42. Most historians, though, agree that their sexual relationship comes to an end in 1750 after about 5 years. So in essence, she remains as official mistress for about 15 years after they stop having sexual relations. So we have these conditions that make a powerful French royal mistress possible, and then history and contingency that are particular to France allow the tradition to develop. So when did the tradition start? What triggers it? In the popular imagination, Agnès Sorel, who was the lover of Charles VII and who died in 1450, she is usually labeled the first official French royal mistress. However, based on contemporary sources, no one would have considered her as such during her own short lifetime, although she was clearly highly favored by the king, and she received gifts of property, she received riches from him. One chronicler wrote about her, Olivier de Lamache. He wrote that the king had recently raised up a poor girl, a gentlewoman called Agnès Sorel, and put her in a position of such triumph and power that her station might be compared to that of the great princesses of the kingdom. Now, a clue that she did in fact exercise influence at the court is that she was apparently poisoned at the age of 28, at the height of her influence. So she's a threat to somebody, right? And it's only about 75 years after her death that Agnès becomes this kind of posthumous celebrity at the court of Francis I again, in the 1520s. And she remains very popular actually to the present day. She's always the ideal of the royal mistress. And Tracy, who actually has written a book on her recently, she speculates that maybe the most important element in creating this legend of Agnès Sorel is this amazing melendiptych with the lactating virgin whose face reportedly bears Agnès' features. So it's significant that Agnès emerged as a celebrity not during her own lifetime, but rather in the 16th century when she becomes this model then for her successors. And once again, this happens in the context of the theatricalization of the French court under Francis I that I made reference to earlier, where more generally women come to play an increasingly visible role. And here, once again, those European ambassadors I mentioned play a role in tracing their rise for us, because ambassadors recognized that women with access to power through family or through sentimental ties, like mistresses, are valuable power brokers. And it's also at the court of Francis I that we see women's power valorized and represented through the artwork that he used to decorate his chateau. And that becomes a stage, in a sense, on which the king performs his kingship and he confers grace on others. And here you see Francis I's gallery at Fontainebleau. He drew particularly on on classical imagery. He associated himself with the pantheon of the gods from Greek and Roman mythology, which actually decorate the walls here. And his mistress is part of this grandeur. Anne de Pompadour, who is the Duchess d'Étampes. She was Francis's most powerful mistress, and she is the first mistress that we really see recognized by ambassadors as a power broker. So in the iconography, she's associated with Venus, the goddess of love. Now, Diane de Poitiers, who's the mistress of Francis's son, Henry II, she would pick up on this classical imagery. She presented herself as Diana the Huntress, which you see here in a fountain that was originally at her chateau at Annay. Subsequent mistresses would continue to associate themselves with this classical imagery, and most of them will also be painted as Diana. But no future mistress is going to be painted as the Virgin, as Agnès Sorel was. That would have seemed sacrilegious at this point when it is a little more obvious what they are. But what the new environment of the court does is it offers the early modern royal mistress this theatrical means of representing her role in a parallel space, in a sense that is understood and accepted by her audience as honorable, even if her actual position was seen as somewhat scandalous. So by the time of Louis XIV, who comes to the throne in 1643 at the age of 5, and he reigns until 1715, the royal court has even more clearly become a site of elaborate spectacle and performance. He sponsors ballets, festivals, operas, and other kinds of productions that become extremely popular. And the royal mistress is by now an expected and recognized presence, and mistresses like the Marquise de Montespan and Louise de la Vallière, whom we see here, they perform on a literal stage in ballets and festivals that are part of court life by this point. So it's against this backdrop that the prominence of the royal mistress increases. And to make the most of her position, the mistress has to be skilled in the management of her image. So there are three mistresses of Louis XIV who attain particular prominence in the historical imaginary. And the first of these is Louise de la Vallière. She was a member of the minor nobility. You see her here with her children that she had with Louis XIV. She is the mistress of Louis's youth when the Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, is still alive. The presence of Louis's formidable mother actually left very little space for a powerful royal mistress. And we've actually found no case where you have both a powerful Queen Mother and a very powerful active royal mistress simultaneously. Louise de la Vallière was willing to sort of remain in the shadows. She was not a particularly adept power player, but as a young man, Louis seemed to like a woman who was sort of self-effacing and docile. By the time the Queen Mother dies in 1666, he's ready for something more interesting, and his attention at that point turns to the Marquise de Montespan. Montespan actually came from one of the oldest and most important noble families in France, and she was known for her beauty, for her wit, for her magnificence. And historians have noted the fact that her reign at court corresponded, in fact, with the most glorious and successful period of Louis's reign. And unlike La Vallière, she brings panache and brilliance to this role. She's a very skilled political player. Other courtiers, and in fact, even Louis XIV's wife, the Queen Marie-Thérèse, on occasion would turn to Montespan to ask for favors or for positions for their friends at court. She's also a very important patron and broker. So she becomes a conduit for pensions, for gifts, emoluments for offices, and even military ranks and commissions. The Marquis de Fouquier actually complained vociferously about her influence on diplomatic and military affairs. And in his memoirs, he lumps together and he complains about the ministers and the mistresses, which I find kind of telling that they're in the same category. Montespan also firmly established the position of royal mistress as patron of the arts. She sponsors painters, writers, musicians, architects, and this is going to set the stage then for Pompadour to take up a similar role in that way. It's also during the reign of Montespan that it becomes increasingly clear that part of the role of royal mistress is to display not only her own charms, but also the glories of France. And notably, Montespan became a fashion trendsetter at a time when France was becoming increasingly known as a center of fashion. So now, despite Montespan's success and Louis's obvious attachment to her, their relationship was in fact somewhat combative and complicated. The sources do suggest that they shared this very powerful physical attachment, more so, I think, than we see with other relationships like these. But once again, by the late 1670s, his needs were changing again, And at this point, he turns to the Marquise de Maintenon, whom ironically, Montespan actually brought to Louis's attention when she became the governess to Montespan's many children with Louis. Montespan presented herself more as a friend and religious confidant to Louis, and she actually encouraged him to spend more time with his much neglected wife, the Queen Marie-Thérèse. But then when the Queen died in 1683, Louis secretly marries Maintenon. So even more so than previous mistresses, Maintenon has a unique role, and she acts as the political advisor and really an unofficial prime minister. So when Louis XIV died in 1715, he was succeeded by his 5-year-old grandson, Louis XV. Louis marries a Polish princess, Marie Leszczyńska, at the age of 15. She was actually 22. Reportedly, he did not take on a mistress until he and his wife had been married for 8 years and had multiple children. They actually have 10 together in the space of just a little over 10 years. And then at that point, she'd had enough. And he turns to other women. He notoriously actually has 3 mistresses from the same family, the Mayinel sisters, whom he moves through. The third of these, Marie-Anne de Mayinel, the Duchess of Châteauroux, died unexpectedly in 1744. She was the last of the 3 sisters that held this role. And while the king grieved deeply, he soon found someone to replace her. And this is the woman who really comes to epitomize both the beautiful and the politically active royal mistress. And that is Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, who is much better known as Madame de Pompadour. Now, I had mentioned earlier that the royal mistress was able to flourish at the early modern French court because of the position as a sort of open secret. The problem under Madame de Pompadour is that the open secret is no longer a secret. And I think there are 3 main reasons for this. First of all, she comes to her position during the Age of Enlightenment in France. And against this backdrop, educated Frenchmen are really beginning to object to the structures of absolutist government in France and the secrecy in particular of the operations of the court. And that makes it a lot more difficult to maintain that veil of secrecy that had shielded the royal mistress's political role. Secondly, Pompadour herself is willing to act much more openly as a political broker and gatekeeper for the king than previous mistresses, as we'll see. And that in turn makes her a target for those who are unhappy about the government's political decisions. And then third, in the past, the open secret of the mistress's political role was made possible in part by the fact that previous mistresses were aristocratic women who already had a reason to be at court because of their family's position. And this is definitely not the case with Pompadour. Pompadour's legal father was a weaver who had made a fortune in finance. Her mother had a somewhat scandalous background. She had a number of lovers, and actually there are questions about Pompadour's paternity. Pompadour's husband, whom she married at a young age, is a member of the financial bourgeoisie in Paris. So while she's a member of the Parisian bourgeois elite, she's definitely not of noble background. In addition, there is also much merriment about her given name, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson. Her last name translates as fish. So you find all kinds of mockery of that. But Jeanne Antoinette was beautiful. She's intelligent. As a young wife, she made a splash in the salons in Paris. And she is also ambitious. She was told from childhood that she was fit for a king, that she was un morceau de roi. And a fortune teller told her that she would one day be the king's mistress. Now here you get echoes of her famous predecessor, Agnès Sorel, and we sort of see this lineage of the mistress as it develops. In the 16th century, the poet Brantôme had written about Agnès Sorel that an astrologer had predicted to Agnès that she would be loved and served by one of the most valiant and courageous kings in Christendom. So this sort of tradition of fortune tellers predicting this position. So given the prophecy, it appears that Jeanne Antoinette consciously tried to bring herself to the king's attention. And the country estate of Étiole near Paris that she owned with her husband was very close to a forest that the king liked to hunt in. So Jeanne Antoinette made sure that the king spotted her strolling around her property when he was out hunting. And that is reportedly where they made their first contact. It's also worth noting that the narrative that emerges of the king and Jeanne Antoinette's meeting in the woods drew conveniently on the by then familiar association of the royal mistress with the goddess Diana the huntress. Pompadour would have Jean-Marc Natier paint her as the goddess Diana around 1746. So already by February of 1745, we start to hear reports of the king's romance with a beautiful young woman that he had met in the forest and with whom he had danced at a masked ball at Versailles. These start to appear. And courtiers heard that the king was pursuing the young and lovely Madame de Pompadour. No one, though, expected that she would rise to the position of the king's mistress. And in fact, the Duke of Luynes initially just dismissed her. He wrote that even if the rumors about this new young woman were true, that she was only a fling. She was a galanterie, not a mistress, because it was inconceivable that a woman who, in his words, whose mother is named Madame Poisson, could be the next official mistress of the king. So there's another important problem actually too with Jeanne Antoinette becoming the king's official mistress. Remember, part of the reason that earlier mistresses could exist in this space as an open secret was because they were noblewomen. They had other reasons to be at court. This is obviously not the case with Jeanne Antoinette. And in fact, Louis has to provide her with a noble title to justify her presentation and then her residence at the court. That is why she becomes Madame de Pompadour, the Marquise de Pompadour. But the widespread knowledge of her original social origins really undermined the open secret that had shielded the previous mistresses. So despite the controversy surrounding a woman from the financial bourgeoisie coming to court, she studies up on all the etiquette and the ritual at Versailles over the course of the summer of 1745 while the king is on military campaign. And then she is presented at court and she settles in to take her place. So what was she like? And here we, of course, get conflicting reports from the sources. Most accounts acknowledge her loveliness and grace. They understand why the king sought her out. The courtier Dufour de Cheverny said that she was a woman who, in his words, every man would like to have as his mistress. And he describes her as having a round face, regular features, magnificent complexion, superb hands and arms, eyes more lovely than large, but with a fire, a brilliance that I have never seen in another woman. The Austrian ambassador, the Prince von Kaunitz, wrote that Pompadour was unquestionably one of the most beautiful women of the city or of the court. Her eyes are blue, almond-shaped, large enough with a charming gaze. The fact that everyone comments on it, you get the impression her eyes were not large. But the shape of her face is oval, the mouth small, a lovely brow, and an especially agreeable nose. The most negative report came from a man who's going to be her implacable enemy her entire time at court. And that is the Marquis of Argenson, who wrote that Pompadour comes from, in his words, the lowest background. She is blonde and pale, without distinction, but with gifts and talents. She is fairly tall and not particularly attractive. And further, he goes on to say that people who are respected at court assert that Madame de Pompadour will soon be dismissed. The reason will be the shame that the king is made to feel for such a misplaced and lowly affection. Now, there's people outside the court also who attacked her in anonymous pamphlets that were called poissonnade, saying that the king had lowered himself in choosing this sort of unknown woman who's a petite bourgeoise, a grisette, which is a lower class shop. So you find people sort of flinging these insults at her because of her background. So the king, though, had obviously chosen somebody that he was physically attracted to, that he admired. How does she manage to keep his attention for over 20 years? And what seems clear is that Pompadour's skill in keeping the king entertained made her essential to him. And most notable was her willingness to arrange dinners, ballets, theater, and musical performances to entertain the king. Now, remember, Louis XV's predecessor, Louis XIV, had made theatrical presentations to court, or central to court life in the early years of his personal reign. Pompadour, however, is the first actual actor and singer to take on the role of mistress. She had actually participated in theatrical productions, amateur theatrical productions, but quite good ones at ATL, where her father-in-law built a private theater for her. So now she brought the theater to court to entertain Louis XV, and she's apparently quite skillful as an actor and as a singer. She performed opera quite famously. So not surprisingly, the invitations to the small theater at Versailles became a mark of favor. Courtiers would eagerly petition to get them. Now, in addition to these amateur theatrical performances, Pompadour also arranged these small and intimate dinners that Louis loved. She was also willing to organize and accompany him on frequent trips away from Versailles to royal properties such as Compiègne and Fontainebleau. And she also took him to her own properties at Crécy and Bellevue, which were quite lovely. These were properties that the king had given to her and which she then furnished according to her own taste. Here's an image of Bellevue from the era of Pompadour. And once again, Dufour de Chavagny notes that she had the great ability to distract the man in the realm the most difficult to entertain, whose preference was for privacy and who realized that his position demanded the contrary, so much so that as soon as he could evade his kingly duties, he would go to her rooms via a secret staircase and dispense with the role of king. So as royal mistress, Pompadour spent much of her time trying to keep the king entertained and amused because, to be honest, he wasn't crazy about the job of being king. And keeping him entertained is not an easy task, apparently. In 1749, Pompadour wrote this letter that is often quoted to her friend, the Countess of Lutzelburg, in which she said, "The life I lead is dreadful. I hardly have a minute to myself, rehearsals and performances twice a week, constant trips to either the Petit Chateau or La Muette, etc. Considerable and indispensable obligations. Consider whether it is possible to take a breath, have pity on me, and do not blame me." Now, another way in which Pompadour followed in the footsteps of earlier mistresses is as a patron of the arts and letters. And she surrounds herself with philosophers, in particular in the 1740s and early 1750s. For example, her friendship with the famous philosopher Voltaire is well known. She gets him his position as historiographer of France, in fact. Pompadour very much likes to present herself as a femme savante and a protector of men of letters. She's usually painted with books around her, other symbols of education in that way. However, as she got older, she became less open to what she saw as the more problematic elements of Enlightenment writings. She didn't particularly like to be criticized, and she did not like for writers to criticize the king. And she eventually ends up withdrawing her protection from a number of the bolder authors. She and Voltaire eventually fall out, for example, although Voltaire remains fond of her and is deeply affected by her death. But the patronage of the arts and architecture continue throughout her reign at court. And she herself is, of course, the subject of numerous paintings by Boucher, by Van Loo. You see two of them here. The one on the left, I actually saw it at the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, and I have a print of that one in my office. Nattier, who painted her as Diane in the slide you already saw, she also sponsors. And so she is painted by the best known artists of her time period, but she also collects paintings. She collects other works of art for her many homes. She's also a printmaker, actually, of considerable skill. Back in 2016, the Walters Museum in Baltimore had an exhibition of Pompadour's etchings. And you can see an example here. An amazing exhibit, and really it demonstrated how talented she really was. And notably, she was also an enthusiastic purchaser of delicate porcelain objects. In 1756, the Manufacture Royale de Porcelaine at Vincennes was moved to Sèvres, from which it would take its name, which is near Pompadour Chateau at Bellevue. And this is an example of their work from around 1760. But so she's very interested in collecting this porcelain, but more generally, it's during the age of Pompadour that the Rococo style really reaches its height, which you see here. She also shares a passion for building and architecture with the king, and that once again also puts her in the tradition of previous mistresses like Diane de Poitiers and Montespan. But these are really expensive hobbies. And contemporaries and later historians excoriated her for the cost of her expenditures at a time of real misery in France. And this is actually a double-edged sword for royal mistresses. Their love of beauty and luxury is something that makes them popular at court, but it's also something that can be used against them to explain the growing anti-monarchical sentiments of the French people. So the romantic relationship between Pompadour and the king. Clearly, in the early years of their relationship, Louis and Pompadour had a sexual relationship, but in Pompadour, we see actually most clearly that sex is only one facet of the role of official mistresses and probably not even the most important one. Now, Pompadour herself suffered from gynecological problems and supposedly, although the sources are sort of suspect, she had supposedly acknowledged her cold nature, meaning she didn't really like sex. She did try to unsuccessfully cure this with various purported aphrodisiacs that were not successful. By 1750, she basically decided that she'd had enough and that the earlier passion between the two of them had attenuated. It was time to shift to a new phase in their relationship, from lovers to friends. And in the same way that she'd drawn on the classical imagery of Diana earlier in their relationship, she's going to make use of classical allegory once again in making the transition to friendship. This is Pigault's statue of Pompadour represented as friendship here. There is, however, no diminution in her importance to Louis. And in fact, in May of 1751, Pompadour is moved to more prestigious new rooms at Versailles that become her headquarters, and for Louis XV become a kind of sanctuary. It seems, in fact, that the shift from mistress to best friend corresponded, in fact, with Pompadour's increasing influence over the king. And it's in this new position that it becomes even more difficult for Pompadour to maintain that open secret that had veiled the position of the royal mistress's political advisor and made it somewhat more palatable to the court and the public. So from about 1751 onward, the point at which their sexual relationship comes to an end, Pompadour becomes Louis's chief political advisor in a much more overt fashion than previous mistresses, and she's able to exercise political influence in a number of ways. First of all, she works very hard to reward her friends and to place them in key positions at court. She makes sure her family members are well placed, they receive noble title. She also arranges marriages for family members and those who are close to her. And of course, marriages among the elite have enormous social and political importance. In addition to helping her friends, though, Madame de Pompadour also takes down her enemies. And over time, she's usually able to dispatch those who try to undermine her. For example, she helped persuade the king to fire the Count of Maurepas, who was the minister of the navy, an enemy she suspected of authoring some of the nasty pamphlets that were circulating about her, including a very thinly veiled allusion to her gynecological problems. More generally, the notorious poissonnades, as they were called, these were sort of scurrilous pamphlets that attacked her and attacked the king that circulated pretty widely in the 1750s in particular. The name of them is a play on her last name, Poisson. She was really upset about these. They caused her a lot of pain, and she, even more than the king, urged the Parisian police to track down the guilty parties and to make sure that they paid a price for publishing these pamphlets about her. Now, in many ways, Pompadour operated sort of discreetly behind the scenes to influence policy and to help her friends and to go after enemies in some cases. But for the king, it was her willingness to assume some of the burdens of kingship that were her greatest gift to him, since he didn't like this part of his job. This she could not do covertly. And what happened over time is that audiences with members of the court became this important service that she provided for the king, who really disliked dealing with courtiers who were petitioning for favors. By the early 1750s, she starts to play a really important role in the political crises that are facing the monarchy, and she also starts to move more openly into the realm of diplomacy. And once again, we know this because ambassadors began regularly meeting with Pompadour. She would meet with them as well as the other courtiers in search of favors daily at her morning toilette when she was putting on makeup. They would all sort of line up to talk to her as she was putting on her face. So Dufault de Chavigny, once again, who is responsible for introducing ambassadors at court, he writes about bringing the Austrian ambassador Kaunitz to meet her at her toilette, along with a group of other men who are prominent at court. Kaunitz, who's the imperial representative to the French court in the early 1750s, he's among the most assiduous of these ambassadors in courting Pompadour's attention. He was well aware of her potential and how much influence she had, and he very carefully solicited her favor. And in fact, he wrote to the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria that if Madame de Pompadour were to take an interest in foreign affairs, she would not serve us badly. She has much goodwill for and confidence in me. And he was correct. In 1756, Austria and France signed a new military alliance. Unfortunately, it is also Pompadour's role in promoting and celebrating this new military alliance that would most damage her reputation among historians, as well as among contemporaries, because this shift is going to drag France into the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. This war is a disaster for the French, who would not only lose all of their North American colonies to the British, but it would also saddle them with an enormous debt. And this is a financial disaster that starts them on the path to revolution in 1789. And public opinion is going to blame Pompadour for her role in making this happen. And this is an important point to emphasize. To act so publicly in this way really seemed to move beyond the traditional limits of what the official royal mistress was supposed to do. Previous mistresses had encouraged and applauded the king's military prowess, and they offered private counsel and private advice. But Pompadour actively participates in the direction of foreign and military matters in a public way that previous mistresses had really avoided. And even those who accepted that women could play a political role at court, they expressed a lot of unease as Pompadour took an increasingly visible part in the negotiation of foreign affairs. And so this open political role makes her a target for popular hatred, especially when you couple this with the disaster of Louis's reign. 7 Years' War, or domestic political problems, and then infighting among the court factions, which gets worse and worse. So despite her power, despite her many successes, Pompadour's role was never an easy one. And in the end, it seems that it's the 7 Years' War that probably destroyed her health. Having supported this diplomatic revolution that brought France into the war, Pompadour very eagerly followed the course of the war once it started. And it did not go well for the French. And so it seems likely that the stress of that ill-fated war contributed to her premature death. Pompadour had never enjoyed good health, but the ignominious course of this war with England and Prussia contributed to it worsening. And that led to her death in April of 1764. This is a painting of her that was started shortly before her death, but was concluded after her death. So Pompadour builds on the existing model of the royal mistress, and yet she shapes it in a way that's going to be very difficult for any future mistress to sustain. And it's going to also, in a way, become emblematic of all that is wrong with the French monarchy in the eyes of many people. And with the open secret exposed, essentially, this position isn't going to go on for long. However, Louis does, in fact, have one more important mistress at Versailles after the death of Pompadour, and that is Madame du Barry. Du Barry's origins, her birth name was Jeanne Bécu, were even more suspect than those of Pompadour. Her mother was a seamstress and later a cook from Lorraine. Her father was thought to be a monk. So she got her start as a domestic servant. She later worked at a fashion boutique where she met and became the lover of a provincial nobleman who was named Jean-Baptiste du Barry. And he introduced her to other men who could help her maintain a lavish lifestyle. And according to some biographers, he's also the one who helped to train her in the sexual arts that would prove to be so enticing to Louis XV. The Duke of Richelieu, who had hoped that he might gain more influence with the king through a friendly mistress, is the one who brought Jeanne Bécu to the king's attention. Her relationship with the king starts in the summer of 1768, but before she could take up residence at Versailles, they had to find her a noble husband so that she could be at court. So she's married off actually to the brother of her protector, to the Count of Du Barry, and she's presented at court in April of 1769. Du Barry was probably less interested in the details of politics than Pompadour, but she also gets involved in political intrigues at Versailles. Unfortunately for her, her sordid reputation and Louis's declining popularity made them both a target of what are called libelles, this sort of scurrilous literature about their sexual activities and its connection to political corruption, essentially. So to pull all this together, under Louis XV, the increasingly visible and powerful royal favorites become a focal point, in a sense, for discontent with the regime. And the fact that the open secret is no longer secret leaves the royal mistresses really more vulnerable than they had been in the past. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in the context of the Age of Enlightenment, there was a demand for new transparency in the politics of the court, right? And an end to the dissimulation. And this lays bare the contradictions that exist in the position of the royal mistress. So Louis XVI, who replaces Louis XV in 1774, is France's last king before the revolution. And he does not have a mistress. However, he does have a very well-known wife, whom several historians have noted functionally serves as both queen and mistress, and that is Marie Antoinette, who we all remember from last season, I guess. So the historian Chantal Thomas wrote of Marie Antoinette that she combined the faults of the first role, arrogance, arbitrariness of absolute sovereignty, with those of the second, duplicity and obsession with appearances. She was also perceived as a greedy spendthrift, which had been one of the charges also leveled at Pompadour and at Du Barry. Marie Antoinette also embraced the role of Queen of Fashion, which is the subtitle of Carolyn Weber's famous book about Marie Antoinette, which was unusual in a queen. It was usually the king's mistress who was the fashion icon. And she also got involved in politics. She was perceived as supporting the interests of her family of origin, the Habsburg rulers of Austria, rather than the French kingdom, which also made her unpopular. So the fact that Louis XVI does not have a mistress meant that not only did the xenophobia that often infected French attitudes towards queens focus on Marie Antoinette, but it combined with the hatred for mistresses who meddled in court politics and exhausted government coffers by spending money on luxurious items for themselves, and also by sponsoring all those artists and painters and musicians who were also expensive to maintain. But this all left Marie Antoinette very vulnerable when the revolution broke out. She, of course, loses her life on the guillotine in October of 1793, about 10 months after her husband. Interestingly, Madame du Barry also goes to the guillotine during the Reign of Terror because she, for many people, had become a symbol, too, of the corruption of the old regime. So the French Revolution of 1789 brought an end to both the monarchy and to the powerful royal mistress, although I would like to note in closing that their influence has an important legacy, and that is the French idea that women exercise unique influence through their charm and beauty, which remains an important part of French national identity today, even. It's sometimes referred to as the French singularity or the Gallic singularity. And it is the French, after all, who in a completely different context coined the phrase cherchez la femme. So thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you.
So if anyone has questions, I'm more than happy to try to answer them.
And you're also free to type them if you don't want to turn camera or speak out, and we can read them out for you as well. If there's any questions.
Julia, would you like to start with an idea? Something?
Sure, though I see that Becky has her hand up in the chat, so I'm happy to start there. I have some chat. I have a lot of thoughts as well, as you can imagine. No, it was such a rich and wonderful presentation.
Right. I'm sorry, my camera seems to have gone off. It was on before. I don't know what's going on, but anyhow, you'll hear my voice.
I do.
This is something where I don't know at all. This is a point of information. I have the impression that after Madame du Barry came in, because she was hated even more, that Madame de Pompadour looked good by comparison, and that there was a little bit of, I'm asking you, was there kind of a nostalgia for her and for what she had done at the court? I mean, I just, the hint of things that I've gotten that from every, the odd remark in the Mercure or memoirs or something.
Right. I think that people thought that she was more intelligent than du Barry. I think that du Barry had a reputation as somewhat flighty and somebody who was in over her head in a sense. And the memoirs that mention her will usually say that she was a lot nicer than Pompadour. I mean, when you talk about nostalgia for Pompadour, I mean, I think it is true that people saw her as a more adept political player, but somebody who wasn't really very nice because of the way that she was so willing to take down her enemies. Whereas du Barry was not vicious in the same way. She laughed about the libelle. She didn't stick the Parisian police on people. And so it's true that I mean, du Barry is hated in the popular imagination because I think she's seen as corrupting the king, and there's a lot more sexual sort of pornography, political pornography written about du Barry, and that was not the case with Pompadour. I mean, I think the images of the two are just very different, I guess.
I guess the second part of that question was, though, I don't think du Barry did the same kind of artistic
No,
so,
I don't. She's not the same kind of patron of the arts. She buys a lot of stuff for herself, but and she has a lovely home. But no, she's not the same kind. She doesn't have the same kind of connections to philosophes or to the world of art and literature that.
So is there anything more to say about the fall off and that kind of entertainment toward that part of Louis XV's reign? He liked that entertainment, but he didn't get it anymore. Right, he's getting something else from du Barry.
Yeah, he's definitely getting something else from du Barry. That's a good question. You get the impression that Pompadour was just so good at sort of stage managing these things and coming up with ways of entertaining him and taking them off to the various. She just sort of kept this constant activity going, and I don't think. I mean, we all know how hard it is to arrange those kinds of things and to be a stage manager, and. Yeah, I mean, I see Grace's point, and yeah, there is definitely a different education level between the two. I mean, Pompadour was very well educated. Du Barry, it's interesting because she's had a bit of a rehabilitation, I would say, in recent years. And I was talking to a British woman who's lived in Paris and was actually writing an article on du Barry's opening of her new apartments at Versailles. They've just refurbished those apartments. And she talked to a historian at Versailles, whose name I don't know, who's working on a book on du Barry, who claims that he's going to sort of expose the fact that she was very much involved in politics and very smart about it. So maybe everything we have to say here is wrong. Who knows?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lisa, and then Nizam. I think Lisa had her hand up just first, but then, yeah, and then Nizam.
Thank you. I was very interested in the letter that you quoted, and I wonder when in that period of her life with the king that letter was written. It seems to me if her life were so disagreeable, so egregious at court, then she had a natural falling off point when she ceased to have a more physical relationship with the king, that she could have extricated herself. And yet she continues for another 15 years. And I'm certain there were many benefits, but I want you can speak to when that was written.
It was written in 1749. And so 4 years in. And I actually did an ellipse in part of that quote, because she also complains in there about the queen and the dauphin and the dauphine just sort of hanging out on their couches while she does all the work. So I think that this is reading about Versailles in the 18th century. This is actually a really common refrain, that they just hate how stressful the life is. They just keeping up with appearances. And Pompadour probably had more reason to complain than a lot of them, because she really was very busy. But they can't imagine going anyplace else. They don't want to give up being at the center of the universe. And so yes, I mean, she certainly could have pulled out in 1750 when their sexual relationship stops. But in fact, she likes having that position and that power. I mean, we all know how reluctant people are to give up power and how they want it back even when they've been voted out, they want to come back. So
yeah, it does seem like she doubled down in that moment.
And finds other ways to make herself essential, right? Because she, in some ways, becomes even more essential to him and does other things to embed herself once they no longer have a physical relationship. And she also gets an official position in 1756 as a dame de palais for the queen. So she makes sure that she can't get booted too easily. So
thank you.
Yeah, Nizam, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you before.
No problem. I read somewhere, and I can't tell you where, that actually what is known as the style, the Louis XVI style, was actually spearheaded by Madame du Barry. And so she maybe wasn't anything with entertainment in terms of theater stuff, but she evidently had an influence on the furniture and the decorative arts.
She apparently had very good taste, and her home at Lucienne, I believe, Lucienne, I think it's something like that she was given by Louis, and that she goes to after she leaves court when Marie Antoinette and Louis the 16th asked her to leave. I mean, was beautifully decorated, and so she was beautiful and had beautiful taste, but she's not someone who is seen as a patron, as a sponsor in the same way. But you are very probably correct in that. So.
Thank you.
Somebody else here might actually know better than I do.
Yeah, Judith has just put it in the chat. Other French historians to the rescue. Thanks,
yes,
Judith.
Please. So, yeah, I mean, that I know less about her sponsorship of the arts in that way. So,
I was wondering, Christine,
that's
it seems, wasn't her the period at which she was actually performing and she was presenting the operas, doesn't that end about the same time that her sexual relationship ends with her?
It does. She, at that point, she spends more time like arranging the dinner parties and the sort of, I've read it described as sort of quiet bourgeois activities that the king so loved. But yeah, her performances end around 1750 as well. And so maybe part of the performance was actually I don't want to say a sexual performance, but a display for the king in a sense. I mean, there might be an element of eroticism in that, in her desire to perform for him in that way that maybe she doesn't want to do anymore once they no longer have a physical relationship. But it's not something I've seen treated in that particular way, but it seems possible. Is that?
I think one of the things we'll get into later this year is how some of the pieces that she performed were sort of metaphors for her and
Right.
Louis,
Well, there's
which
this
will be interesting. But
there's this famous case of her singing an aria from Lully that was something basically you were at my mercy. I can't remember the exact title of that she basically was bragging about the fact that the king was under her sway. Judith, it looks like you remember the name of it, so you're muted.
Sorry, I don't remember the exact story, but I know that very early on she managed to get herself invited to a party at Versailles, and then invited to play at the harpsichord, and also really gets Louis's attention. I don't know what she sang,
Right.
but then from then on, so many of her paintings, like if they're actually of her rather than her as a Diana or whatever, she'll have a harpsichord there as a reminder to him that was how he had first seen her.
There's also, there's various stories about that aria that she sings where she's basically bragging about having the king under her influence. Another story that I read in somebody else's book was that she had brought a flower arrangement to the queen, and the queen had said, "So I hear you sing, why don't you sing for me?" And she breaks into that particular aria, which is seen then as a huge insult of the queen, that she's singing, basically bragging about having the king under her control. So this is why the sources are really ambiguous, or you find different stories in different places about these things. So anyway,
it seems that one of the themes that is so particular to her is you see social mobility and the use of the arts as part of social mobility, and I wonder if we see that in other places outside of the mistresses. Whether there's other movement between bourgeois and court in the same way. Certainly is by performers who.
Right. I suppose by performers, although performers would not have ever gotten the status that would have allowed them to be at Versailles. And I just can't imagine, you're right that Pompadour was extremely well educated, and she was very active in Salon society before she ever came to Versailles, and that gave her, breeding. She had been trained as a singer. She was, musically very adept. She was trained as an actor, but that would not get you access to court unless you were somebody's mistress. I don't see any way to make that leap unless you married somebody or unless the king wanted to bring you to court. There's just not that. There's only so far you can move up just by your talents and your beauty, unless you leverage that beauty capital, I guess, into or through a sexual relationship. I don't think so.
I guess I was wondering whether, for instance, other members of the lower nobility would take wives who were performers and not just mistresses who were performers. Whether that was, I don't know.
Yeah, it's common in England, isn't it, for the king to have mistresses who are performers, who are actresses. Charles II with Nell Gwyn, and I think there's 18th century noblemen, and it's quite common. So performers certainly. But but they're different social categories. So Callum actually, remember, he's got the name of it's from Armide. That is exactly the one. Finally, he is in my power. So that was the one I was trying to remember. So.
Oh, it's Il est dans ma puissance. The most famous aria.
Enfin,
il est dans ma puissance.
Yep. Yeah. So.
Of course, that's when Armide has a knife over the sleeping Renault.
Well, one can interpret these things in different ways, I guess.
Yeah, right?
So
that's fun.
I was going to say, I did see Rebecca had the hand symbol up before. Did you still have something you wanted to add?
Oh, I was just going to say it has to have been Armide, because, and what a riot that is. That's what a hoot. She's really smart if she picked that one, because there's Armide with her knife trying to kill Renaud, and then she can't because she falls in love with him. So there's a reverse in the middle. And so it's saying that, yes, I'm going to kill him. He's in my power, but then I'm going to be in his power because I've fallen in love with him. It's just perfect in every way. It's got to have been that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. It is definitely that one. That is the one I was trying to remember. I just couldn't recall the name. So anyway.
So I guess we'll go to Judith and then we'll hit Emma's because I do see a question in the chat as well. Oh wait, you're muted again, Judith.
I managed to mute and unmute myself all in one. Yeah. But anyways, perhaps upward mobility, not within exactly the royal household, but the Orléans family. I'm very interested in what's going on, especially in the Palais Royal area.
Mhm.
And there, the Duc d'Orléans, the guy who becomes Philippe Égalité, he and his wife, and then his second wife, are very connected to the world of the theater and established their own
Right.
theater there. But that's a different kind of social mobility, and they're seen as scandalous and corrupt and highly
Right.
problematic.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And so bourgeois and actors are sort of in very different categories. So you know.
And so from Emma, we do have a question. Do you think that the role of mistress has completely faded out, or do you see elements of it in different roles today?
Well, the position of the royal mistress as we define it sort of goes away with the revolution, because, you know, with the different polity that you have after the French Revolution, with the creation first of a republican form of government, but even, you know, with governments where some people have the vote now, when men have the vote and women don't, it just creates a very different situation. Mistresses clearly do not go away. I mean, kings continue to have mistresses, and in fact, I mean, Francois Mitterrand very famously at his funeral, his mistress and daughter showed up, you know, alongside his wife. And so, oh, I'm having mental blanks tonight, but the previous president or the previous president who's went to, his mistress famously had a sort of meltdown publicly, and he went off, and somebody must remember the name. When the French, I can't remember them, but you know, I mean, the French famously are very sort of blasé about these things, and that is, I think, a continuation of this sort of idea of the Gallic singularity, the French singularity, that men and women have this unique relationship, this harmonious relationship based on conversation and gallantry and stuff, and it also affects French discussions about things like Me Too and feminism, and they think that they have a much better way than the American way, and it I think comes out of that tradition of conversation at court. So
I'm not sure about much about the French politicians and or French royalty and mistresses currently, but
there's no French royalty.
But I've got a story about French royalty and artists today.
Yes,
which is that I was at a dinner party and speaking to this very charming woman in France, and she was telling me about how she was born in Spain because her family couldn't live in France anymore, and after a while I said, well, and she said, well, yeah, my brother would be king if there were a king, and so she's like the last Orléans. She says, but we're all artists now, so I thought, well,
so she's an Orleanist. My hair guy Guillaume actually follows the successor of the guy who should have been the French king in 1875. Had they actually decided to have the monarchy, what was it, was it Henry V he would have been, I guess. But anyway, so there are people who continue to be royalists, but they are not ruling at the moment.
No.
So.
Well, they're painting now. They're
Yes.
on the web. They're painting now.
So.
Oh, I like sort of the wrap-up point of thinking about these contemporary resonances, and this also whets our appetite for the next in our Salon series, where we're really thinking more about the logistics of this musical patronage.
Right.
And Callum will be speaking with us, as well as some musicians joining us. So perhaps anyone who wants to say could wrap up for a few more minutes, and those who have dinner plans and the like can join us one last time. And thanking so much our speaker. Thank you so much, Christine, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you so much for coming. It was really a pleasure talking about this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
And just to let you know, our next session will be Monday the 28th with Callum Blackmore and also Jacob Ashworth, the conductor. or the composer and conductor of the program on December 2nd in the Salons of Versailles.
Violinist, and chamber musician. Yeah.
So excited to hear the talk on the 28th. So
It'd be great.
thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Julia and Christine.
Thank you.
Thank
That's
you.
great. You
What a
packed a lot.